HTS wanted to conquer the whole country, going all the way to Damascus, overthrowing the regime. But I don't believe that they thought that it would necessarily happen so quickly. They're trying to create a stable environment in Syria, even if one might disagree with their, Islamist worldview. I'm Aaron Zelin, the Gloria and Ken Levy Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I've been studying Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the new leaders of the Syrian caretaker government, going back to when they first founded themselves at the beginning of the Syrian civil war, and even wrote a book about them called The Age of Political Jihadism, a study of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. What happened in late November, early December 2024 was a shock to many in the world related to the fall of the Assad regime and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham's takeover of the country alongside allies in the insurgency. Based off of what we could tell, it seemed that much of their efforts were to attempt to take over Aleppo, but because of how poorly the regime did, as well as the fact that the regime's allies in Russia and Iran, as well as Shia militia, did not come to the aid of them quick enough, HTS decided to continue to move. By then, it became more of an existential fight. The regime essentially didn't have enough time to muster a proper counteroffensive. The regime fell within 10 or 11 days, which I don't think anybody would have predicted. Researchers, analysts, anybody on the ground in Syria, HTS themselves, them being in Damascus was a huge shock, and that's why they've been having to develop this whole system out of cloth, because they didn't necessarily have a full-scale plan for the whole country, but they had more of a, bespoke plan for how to take over Aleppo and then administer it afterwards right away. I think overall the reactions to the fall of the regime have been positive. Of course, this was the fall of Bashar, but the rule of the family goes all the way back to his father Hafiz in 1970. So this was more than 50 years of totalitarian rule against the Syrian population. Many people, even if they didn't necessarily like HTS per se, we're happy that there was potentially a new opening and more freedom and possibility to make life better, considering the fact that the regime more or less destroyed the whole country during the almost 14 years of civil war. There's a lot of challenges with this new Syrian caretaker government. The main ministers that have come into place in this new government were previously the ministers in HTS's civilian government called the Salvation Government, previously in northwest Syria. Ruling just a small area in northwest Syria is much different than most of the country. For one, northwest is primarily all Sunni Muslims, more conservative. But once you start getting into larger cities, you get into dealing with a larger percentage of minority groups. You also have to deal with that there are many Sunni Muslims that are not religious at all. They're secular, and they want to have freedoms, and they don't want to have to live by any, religious diktats. We've already seen that there have been some changes that the new government has made that has been a bit different than what we saw previously. You do see women in government meetings now, whether they're wearing a hijab or not. A lot of what the government's focused on is mainly getting humanitarian aid, lifting sanctions, rebuilding the economy. A lot of the Syrian population wants to be seen as being a part of this process too, and not just being dictated at. Time will tell on if they maintain this sort of greater level of maybe openness compared to how they maybe ruled in northwest Syria. HTS, the caretaker government, has been trying to pursue a lot of avenues to try and put everyone back together again. One of the first things that the new government has been trying to do is to try and unify the security and military forces between the various insurgent factions. And so far, at least with the Southern Operations Room as well as the Syrian National Army, they've been able to come to an agreement that they would essentially cede power to the new Ministry of Defense. There, of course, remains holdout from the Syrian Democratic Forces. Many of them are Kurdish in origin and not Arab, and therefore they want to make sure that they secure their rights. But they've also had their own experience over the last 10 years or so, having built up the autonomous administration of North and East Syria. They've also been involved in high-level military training with the US and the global coalition against ISIS, and therefore they're highly trained, and this is going to be one of the harder things to deal with. Of course, there have been back channels between the new leader of Syria's administration, Ahmed al-Shara, and the leader of the SDF, Mazloum Abdi. I think that both sides understand that for the betterment of Syria, that there should be some form of diplomatic resolution to this, and that they don't want to go to blows militarily because it'll undermine the security of Syria, especially since it could hurt the fight against ISIS, and both HTS and the SDF do not want ISIS to rebound or be able to take advantage, since it's a threat to all of them. The US is in a very unique position. I think we have to understand that what happened in Syria doesn't happen every day or every year. The country that previously had been an adversary to the United States could become an ally and partner in the future. There's an important debate to be had whether we want to take an interest-based approach versus one that's values-based approach. One that's a values-based approach might be a little bit more difficult, considering the fact that for now there isn't an inclusive government. It's mainly loyalists of what was HTS or their own allies. If the United States takes an interest-based approach, I think there's a lot of space to maneuver here in many respects, whether it's related to potential sanctions relief, whether it's to try and make sure that all of the United States' allies and partners in Europe and the region work towards a common goal. Even if the United States doesn't want to go all in on helping the Syrian government, it still could play a role in assisting and moving with its allies to hopefully create a positive environment in Syria that leads to the local population being able to live a better life once again. And even if it's not ideal and perfect, there is opportunity for the United States and its allies and partners in the region to hopefully make Syria a better place for the local population, as well as within the international system. And it's important to continue to compare and contrast sort of what the government is saying and what it's actually doing to try and keep them honest on some levels. Some might worry about their past. I think a lot of their actions in the intervening 8.5 years, and even more so in the last almost 2 months, have illustrated that this has been sincere on some levels. Otherwise, I don't think people in many countries would be engaging them so closely and diplomatically and talking about easing sanctions so quickly. This isn't like the Taliban, where they're gaslighting about the relationship with al-Qaeda, where HTS is not only talk the talk, but they've walked the walk in terms of going against ISIS, going against al-Qaeda. During HTS's offensive against the Assad regime, the leader of the group, previously known as Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, started to use his real birth name, Ahmed al-Shara, as a way to bring legitimacy more to his movement, and also to maybe showcase that his past as this militant leader of a jihadist organization was in the past. And there's been this huge transformation over the last 8.5 years. But him using his actual real name instead of a nom de guerre, essentially, was a way to provide some level of legitimacy that maybe he wouldn't have had earlier, but also showcasing that he was transforming into more of maybe a political civilian role as a leader of this movement and group, and eventually now the new Syrian administration post-Assad, than one that was just strictly a military commander and affiliated more with militant activities. I guess the main thing to understand is that this is a complicated issue. It's not black or white. And so it's important to recognize that while many stopped paying attention to Syria about a decade ago, a lot has transformed in that intervening period, especially the players in the new government and their movement. It's been a very slow and gradual process, and it's been very complicated and back and forth. It's not an all or nothing proposition, but I think we should be looking at this as a hopeful opportunity instead of something that we should fear.